So if you've followed this podcast for any amount of time, you know that one of my biggest issues as a homesteader is growing, well, really growing anything, but especially fruit. I figured out how to stumble along with a lot of vegetables here on the Wyoming prairie, but fruit trees are something I have completely given up on. I don't even think about it anymore. Until the other day when I happened across an email in my inbox talking about a new book coming out all about growing apples in cold climates. So I hit reply immediately to schedule the author for a chat because I am bound and determined if there's a way to grow an apple in Wyoming, I'm going to figure it out. So welcome to the podcast, Bob.
Thank you very much.
I
Good to
am
be here.
very excited for this conversation. But before we get into all of my woes around growing apples or not growing apples, can you give us a little background on what got you into this area of interest? Orchards and apples and all that good stuff.
Well, in the 1970s, I was a cabinet maker. And then I went out and bought 5 apple trees at the local store, planted them, and they really did terribly. Some of them killed back, some of them never ripened. And it got me interested in apple cultivars. And then I got interested in rootstocks and so forth. And it sort of took off from there. And I learned how to graft. And learning how to graft was like learning a sort of magical procedure, because you take this little piece of wood from the apple that you want, stick it onto a rootstock, and somehow it unites. And lo and behold, you have a new apple of the kind that you want. And I just thought that was miraculous. So my father actually had bought an old farm near us, and just to be near us, and it had great soil. And where I was living before was a gravel pit and a frost pocket. So I moved over here and we started to graft apples. Then gradually we ended up, now we grow about 1,000 different cultivars and species of anything perennial and hardy. So that sort of got me into it. And apples have always been kind of our specialty.
Yeah. So where you live in Canada, what's your climate like in your particular region? I'm assuming you're fairly harsh.
We are sort of, we're in the maritime provinces, so we're in southeastern New Brunswick. So it's very changeable. We can go to -40, and which is Celsius or Fahrenheit's the same. And then it can rise up again, and all of a sudden we'll be in the 50s, and then it'll plunge back down. So it is a challenging climate for a lot of material. And so we sort of started out collecting different cultivars of apples. Some didn't work out, some did. And gradually we ended up with, I have probably at least 120 or 130 different cultivars of apples now.
Okay. So I have a lot of questions for you, but I just have to ask it straight out. I mean, we live in Southeast Wyoming, where it sounds like we're similar to you, where we can get down to, 30 below, and then a week later it's up to 50 and it goes back and forth. We get a lot of blizzard type conditions with extreme wind, blowing snow. Is it even possible for me to grow apples, or should I just focus on something else?
No, I think one of the keys would be you need moisture in the soil. So if you get really, really dry, that's going to be a bit of a problem. As far as the ups and downs go in the cold, there are a lot of apples here that originally came out of places like Russia and, very, very cold climates. A lot of the original apple, or the place where the original apples were, is in southern Kazakhstan. And a lot of those apples grew on the steppes there, which were really dry and windy and so forth. So, I think the most important thing you'll choose is the type of apple that you're going to plant, because you're not going to have good luck probably growing Red Delicious or Macintosh or, some of the more common ones. But places like the University of Minnesota and a lot of the prairie provinces have been breeding apples now for almost a century. And a lot of those are good for like zone 3 conditions, even zone 2 conditions. So again, those apples should be able to throw anything that you can, or take anything you can throw at them.
Okay. I had tried a number of years ago. I got a couple decent sized trees from a local nursery, and I planted them. One died immediately. The other one lingered painfully for about a year or 2 years. And then finally I was actually longer than that. I gave it some time, and then it just kind of shriveled up, and then it was gone. So I'm assuming those were just the wrong variety potentially.
It could be that, and it also could be the rootstocks that they're on, because almost every tree is actually a combination of a root and then the top. So the top can be super hardy, for instance, but if it's put on like an English dwarfing rootstock or something, it's not going to survive in your site. So you need to have really tough rootstocks as well as tough tops. So we graft a lot of our apples here on something called Antonovka, and that is a very hardy Russian cultivar that produces good seedlings for grafting onto, and they'll take -50. So
Okay.
it's really important that you understand that the apple is actually two different apples, and so both of those have to be good. And also it depends on what kind of shape, when they came from the store, what kind of shape were they in. So a lot of different factors there, and soil, of course, is important too. I don't know what your pH is there, your acidity levels in your soil.
Yeah, I think the last time I had it tested, we weren't super acidic. We were pretty middle of the road. We weren't
Neutral.
leaning one,
Yeah,
yeah, pretty neutral. We weren't leaning hard one way or the other.
yeah, because apples grow best just below neutral, sort of 6.5 to 7. That's
Okay.
ideal. So if you have that, and you can work in some compost, and keep them at least watered well the first season, and stake them for wind for the first year, especially.
Mhm.
And I would recommend that you probably stick with what we call standard roots. These are like an old-fashioned tree. A lot of the dwarfing rootstocks, they need to be staked or tied up to a system of posts and wires pretty much for their whole life. Otherwise, they'll lean, and they tend to be sort of brittle roots. But if you have a standard root, you're going to have probably the best chance of success.
Okay, that's good. I did not realize, like you were saying, there's the rootstock and then there's the top. I did not realize there was the kind of two different pieces that you're looking at there.
Yeah, they're two
That's
different
news to me.
plants.
Okay, yeah, had no idea. I know nothing, obviously. So, um, if someone's listening or watching this, maybe they're not in an extreme climate as I am, but they're thinking, what do I need to look for, or what do I need to go to a hardy apple or just a regular apple? Like, what parts of a climate are going to be harder on an apple tree? I know there's a lot of varieties, but just kind of as a general rule.
Well, I mean, you have the minimum winter temperature, and that is the essential factor that determines a hardiness zone. So if you know the zone that you're in, you want to try to find an apple that's rated for that zone. So if you go to -35, well, maybe you're in a zone 4, or you know if you're colder than that, go to -40 every winter, then you'd be in the zone 3 or even 2. So that's critical, and also, like I say, the rootstock is important as well. It's probably best to try to order from a nursery that specializes in hardy trees, because a lot of the stock that's brought in, it might have been grown in Washington State, right, or Oregon, and so you ship it in, and it's soft wood, because they've got a long season. It's very warm, hardly gets any frost, right? And then you stick it in to a Wyoming situation, and it does not survive well. So
Yes.
for instance, our trees here, probably we can't get the kind of growth that you could get further south, but the growth that we do get has what I call a better carbohydrate to water ratio. So they're tougher, right? And I think that's important as well.
Okay. Where I know you're in Canada, so you probably have different sources. But do you know of places where, like, maybe we could order online these different or tougher varieties, or is it kind of a regional thing?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, I don't know too many of the hardy nurseries I think probably a trip on Google would probably be worth it. And you want to
Yeah.
look in places like Minnesota, South Dakota, North Dakota. These are places that do have programs for breeding programs and so forth. I know Minnesota has a huge program there, and they have a lot of different cultivars that are excellent for really hard climates.
Okay. Is there any in particular like names you could share as far as like the different cultivars that you would recommend, or would that just be something probably Google?
Yeah, I mean there are quite a few actually. I was
Okay.
looking at there's some old-fashioned types that are harder to find now, like yellow transparent would be a good one. Alexander, red astrakhan, but some of the newer ones. My favorite is frostbite,
Okay.
which comes out of Minnesota, and that is a really tasty apple, and it's a zone 2. It's
Hmm.
super hardy.
So it'd be like
There's
tropical here for it. Yeah.
and there are others like Goodland and Carroll and Parkland. These are all like super hardy
Okay.
apples.
Okay. So maybe I've declared my inability to grow just a little prematurely. I just wasn't looking at
I think.
the right types. Yeah. Okay. I'm feeling hopeful. So let's say I order some trees. They're coming here, and like give me the rundown of how to plant them for the best possible result. Should I do it now, like springtime, or should I wait a different time of year?
If you're buying a bare root tree, what I would do is plant it. Hopefully it's dormant, so this would be early spring, or you can do it once they start to lose their leaves in the fall. If it's a potted tree, of course, anytime you can work the soil, you can put in a potted tree. I think the what I would do is dig a hole that's wider than high or deep. You only need to go as deep as the root system is, and then go wider because most of your roots are going to grow horizontally, and most of the feeding happens within the upper 6 inches or so of soil. And what I would do is use the same soil that you're digging out, but work in maybe about 20% of a good quality compost. Uh, Things like alfalfa meal, fish meal, bone meal, and so forth. Sprinkle some of that in as well, and then really soak it in. What you want to do is you want to settle the soil around the roots, so there's no big air pockets or whatever. Stake your tree for at least for the first year. After that, you can take it off if it's a freestanding type tree. Um, and I would say just keep your watering up, especially the first season. And after that, it should be able to manage by itself. If you get a potted tree, the only difference is sometimes if you've ever taken a plant out of a pot, you'll see the roots coiled around. Well, that's not a good thing because they'll tend to stay coiled. And so you want to tease those roots out so that you can spread them in the hole. You try to keep the ball together, but the outside roots try to spread out. And then again, soil around them carefully and a good soaking.
Okay. How many would you recommend? Is there like, do I need to have a certain number for pollination, or for just a typical family? We have a family of 5. Would one tree be sufficient, or should we do several?
Well, if there are no trees, other apples around you, you need at least 2 compatible varieties or
Okay.
clones. And so, you might want to choose like a one early apple, and then a couple of like a cooking apple and a good keeping apple for dessert or whatever. So, 3, I would say, would be a really good number for a family. And once they start to produce, that'll produce a lot of apples.
Okay. How long are we looking at if I get a bare root stock, like till we
It
are getting apples?
it depends a lot on the cultivar that you're planting and the rootstock. Um, there's some like there's an old apple called Northern Spy. It used to be a really important pie apple, and on a seedling root that would take 6 or 7 years before you saw an apple. But you can put that same cultivar on a dwarfing root, and it'll produce within 3 years. Most apples I always say an average of 4 years, you're actually seeing production. You might get the odd apple before that, but not what you call a crop. And
Okay.
then 4 to 5 years, then you're starting to go into production.
That's honestly sooner than I thought. I was expecting a lot more. Are these going to, like these hardier apples, are they going to be sizable, or are these going to be smaller trees for the most part?
Uh, well, again, the rootstock has almost more to do with that than the cultivar.
Okay.
So the rootstock, again, if you have a standard apple, you can, if you don't prune it, it'll go up maybe 25, 30 feet tall.
Oh, okay.
But if you have a hardy dwarfing rootstock, they can be like 40% of that. So you might only get 10, 12 feet high.
Okay.
The only problem, of course, is you got to make sure that if it's a dwarfing root, then there are hardy ones out there. There's one called Budagovsky 9, and another one, there's a Geneva, New York has put out a whole selection. There's one called Geneva 41 that we use a lot, and that's it's a hardy dwarfing rootstock. So that, you know, a lot of that is controlled by the relationship between the rootstock and the top.
Okay. That makes sense. We have a couple spots in our yard. We had some ash trees that a beetle came through and took them out, which was devastating.
Oh yeah,
I'm trying to figure out what to replace those with. I'd love to put apple trees there. They need to be, you know, I don't want a shrub. I want more of a decent sized
right.
tree since it is the yard. So that maybe this would work then if they're getting, 10 feet
Yep.
or more.
Yep.
So, okay,
I think so.
awesome. So what does maintenance look like from year to year? I mean, again, I know nothing about fruit, but when I'm reading different homesteading books or seeing other people with orchards, I'm hearing words like pruning and grafting, and there's oils and sprays. Like, what does that look like to keep your tree in optimal condition?
Well, if you want to produce quality fruit, um, that takes a lot of maintenance. And what I mean by that is that everything likes to eat apples. They have high sugar content, so there are insects, there's fungal diseases, and so forth. And right off the bat, what I would suggest is, if you can, try to locate cultivars of apples that are disease resistant. And over the past half century, they have developed a large number of apples that do not get scab, which is one of the worst problems with apples. And some of them, like Liberty is one I can think of, doesn't get scab, doesn't get mildew, doesn't get fire blight, just super easy in terms of fungal diseases. And after that, then the insects are the problem. And I mean, we probably don't have time to go into everything, but basically, over the last few decades, there's been tremendous research into organic ways of protecting pests from pests. So there are new materials, for instance, developed from soil fungi that act as insecticides, but are totally innocuous to mammals. So we use those for things like what we call apple maggot and codling moth. There are mating disruptors that can be used. You just tie them to the top of the tree, and over the season they confuse, like the codling moth doesn't know where to mate and so forth. And there are materials that you can use that you just sort of flip your your backpack sprayer on the undersides of the leaves there about every fourth tree, and the apple maggot, when they come up, they're attracted to it, they eat it, they die. And so it's kind of an exciting time, because it used to be that spraying apples was a dangerous business, because you're using very toxic materials, and we were eating toxic materials. And so what we're seeing is really a renaissance, I think, of apple growing that can be done organically, which is exciting to me, because we don't use pesticides or fungicides here. So,
Yeah.
And in terms of pruning, in the first years, what you're trying to do is create a balanced scaffolding of branches. So try to maintain a single leader, so you don't ever touch the leader. And rather than cutting back branches, which is called heading back, what you want to do is just thin the branches along the stem so that you have a branch in different directions every foot or so, 8 inches to a foot. And then once you've established that sort of basic scaffolding, then as it grows larger, you want to just thin it out so that so that sun and air can circulate uh, inside the tree. And if they have access, if all of the flowers, for instance, or the fruit has access to light, you're going to get better color. It's going to ripen earlier. Um, that's what I've been doing the last few days is in the orchard now. I'm basically going through and pruning out sometimes maybe half the wood, but these are older trees that I'm dealing with. They're 40 some years old. So, I mean, it's not something you can plant them and just leave them and you will get fruit. But generally, it will only be good for maybe making cider or whatever.
Okay.
But if you want to have clean fruit, then you need to do your research. And that's one of the reasons I wrote the book, was that there's so little out there on these new products and so forth. And also, the diversity of apples is something that I think needs to be kind of emphasized to people, that there are really thousands of different apples out there. Um, but what we see now in the stores is basically you're lucky to see more than 5 different apples in the grocery store, because what we've selected for are beautiful looking dessert apples, right? Now, in the old days, they were picked more for keeping ability, cooking, sauce, baking. So yes, there were dessert apples, but there was also cider, because when apples first arrived in North America, they were used basically to make alcoholic cider, because you couldn't keep them. They had no refrigeration except for in a root cellar, and that's why they're good keepers, where the hard ones are good. But most of them were used to create cider, because cider you could store, and it was always in demand.
Yeah. It reminds me a lot of the heirloom vegetables, how we're so used to just a few varieties at the grocery store of vegetables, but when you open up heirloom seed catalog, there's all the different colors of carrots and tomatoes, and sounds like the
Yeah,
same thing has happened with apples.
yeah. It's interesting too that when it seems that whenever things are dying out, there's always people that arise out of nowhere, it seems. And it's the same with apples. Like you have these apple, what would you call them? Apple investigators that are going out and trying to find all these old apples in these old orchards before they're extinct. And they've recovered an innumerable number of apples. And it's quite exciting, actually. So we have things like the Black Oxford, which used to be grown in Maine, but there were only a few trees left. But now they're being distributed all over the country again. So it's kind of this renaissance. It's this,
Yeah.
and there's so many different flavors. It's like people that tend to have the same flavor given to them, over it's this sort of sweet, tends to be sweet, crisp, juicy. Nothing wrong with that. Those are great, but there's so many different textures and tastes and so forth.
Yeah, worth exploring for sure. All
Yeah.
the wide world. Yes. What's your favorite variety personally?
Well, for me, it was always what they call frostbite. It used to be called Minnesota 447. And it's just a smallish apple. But the way I describe it is it's sort of like comparing wine to brandy. It's like all of the aromas are intensified in this apple. And it's just, it's kind of like people say it tastes a bit like sugar cane and molasses and nuts. And, it's very, very, it's unusual in flavor, not like anything I've ever had before. And I mean, one of the newer ones that's really good is ambrosia, and that's along the lines of your sweet kind of dessert, but it's a beautiful aromatic apple. Um, there's so many, there's so many. It's hard to concentrate on just one. But
And how many did you say at the beginning of the interview? How many you have your orchards? How many
The
varieties?
orchard probably has around 60 or 70, and then I have other places that I've planted newer cultivars and so forth. So we probably have 150 maybe.
That's
I don't
fantastic.
keep
And are you
track.
working? I'm sure at some point you're just like, eh. Are you working on bringing in some of those? I'm assuming some of those older varieties and kind of re-energizing those
Yep.
cultivars. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean we talk with other people and have scion swaps, and there are people that will let me know if they have an older apple, and most of the time I have it already, but we're always finding new ones, so, or old ones that maybe. And also we have people coming to us with wild apples they found that they think are exceptional, so
Mm,
we'll propagate those for them and maybe plant one ourselves and see what it's like.
okay. What are the main differences there? Or just, I mean, just maybe that's an obvious question, but just the wild versus the varieties that are wild. Like, what are we looking at difference wise?
Well, actually, the apple genome is huge. It's twice as big as a human genome. And so every time the two apples cross, they produce something that's totally unique and usually unlike the parent, actually. Sometimes it is, but usually they'll resemble a mother tree more than the other. But you never know what you're going to get. You can have most seedlings will be what I call bitters or spitters. They'll not be something the average person would want to eat. They could be quite tannic or whatever, but you can have a fabulous apple at the same time from that same cross. And so a lot of the wild apples that we have around here, for instance, we find in the hedgerows, they're not bad. I mean, you can eat them, but every once in a while you'll find one that's really, really quite tasty. But to have an apple that actually makes it commercially into the wider world, it has to taste good, generally look good. It has to store well now. And a lot of these old timers or the wild apples and so forth, they won't meet all the criteria for a commercial apple.
Right. Okay. How did Red Delicious become the one? Do you know any history on that one? Because I don't like them. I mean,
No.
not to be rude to the apples, but I just don't like them, and I think there's such superior, even in my limited knowledge. Do you know any juicy information, pun intended, of how
Well,
that came to be the one?
it actually is an interesting story that the original Red Delicious is called Hawkeye. It was found in Iowa. A farmer kept cutting it down and kept coming back, and he finally said, "Well, if thee will wants to grow, I will leave thee." And anyway, it was actually a striped apple, striped. And what happened over the period of a century, really, is that red sports kept appearing, and these were darker colored than the original. The interesting thing is that a lot of the aromatics in the apple are connected with yellow skin and green skin. And so the apple was, quote, prettier as time went on. They kept getting redder and redder and redder, but they actually were losing flavor. Originally, the apple tasted better than it does now. But even so, I mean, I find it's kind of like eating cardboard. It's one of my least favorite apples, and I think a lot of people have realized that they've been eating it just because it looks good, right?
Yes.
And it has become iconic. It was the best-selling apple in North America for many, many, many years. Now we have things like Gala is probably the #1 apple. There are still Honeycrisp is huge right now in the north. And again, Honeycrisp was chosen for that crackling crispness. I don't think it's that flavorful. It's not bad, but it keeps really, really well. And so the growers love it.
Yes.
And it's actually saved a lot of northern orchards because they used to be growing things like Macintosh and Cortland and so forth. And as these new apples arrive from places like New Zealand and Australia, they're cut into their market. And so the the Honeycrisp came along, and all of a sudden, instead of getting $90 a bin in Chicago for Macintosh, they're getting $500 a bin for Honeycrisp. And so overnight, it has changed. Like never before has an apple taken off like Honeycrisp has. And it's interesting because it doesn't grow well in a lot of areas. As you go further south, it becomes mealier and softer, and so you have to have those kind of warm days and crisp nights to really ripen it properly.
So where would that be, like Washington State for a Honeycrisp? Where are those growing
No,
predominantly?
Washington State will grow them, but they're not as good as the ones grown in Minnesota or the Maritime provinces and so forth. You need that cold nights, and Washington State doesn't have that, so they tend to be not as tasty, not as crisp. So it really is, and apples are like that. An apple will tend to grow really well in, let's say, the Midwest of the US, but you take it north and it never ripens properly, or it's too hard, or so they do seem to prefer certain areas. And some are very, very adaptable and they'll grow just about anywhere, but they're all different.
Interesting. And I had wondered that, what you said about the Red Delicious, if that was the case, it was for looks and not so much taste, which
Yeah,
I was right. So I don't know, I love food history of just how things came to be, especially when we're talking about the food that we see in the grocery store that people just assume is normal. When you start to know the history of some of that, it's actually, there's a lot more to it. So
oh yeah,
always find that interesting. Kind of off topic slightly, but back to growing, I just had a thought pop in my mind. We built a greenhouse a couple years ago. It's a fairly large structure. It's unheated, and we use it just to grow greens and brassicas and such during the winter. Am I correct that we would not want to put apple trees in a greenhouse situation, just because maybe it would be too warm?
yeah. What's going to happen? It's going to heat up. You get a sunny day in the winter, it's going to heat up. It's going to the water will come back into the cells, and then at night it's just going to freeze, and it would probably kill the trees, I would say.
Okay. So
Unless it's, if you're keeping it sort of above freezing with some sort of heat, it's possible. But an apple has to go through a period of cold usually in order to complete its sort of life cycle, if you will. It needs a rest period, dormant period, and then a growth period, and then another dormant period.
Okay. And that's what I think I had heard that, because we had been researching maybe geothermal or some sort of sustainable heating systems for the greenhouse, because we know of people who grow citrus in theirs, but I was thinking maybe if we do citrus, we'll keep the apples outside. Not that I'm very confident we'll grow citrus, but just for long first lands. So what is your favorite way to eat apples? I know there's so many options, but what's your number one favorite?
Well, of course, I mean, they're good right off the tree, but I would say an apple crisp is one of my favorite desserts. I just love an apple crisp. And also sweet cider. Like we take usually a combination of apples, but there's one called Liberty that we use a lot. And it just creates almost a syrupy cider that it's just, if you haven't, most of the ciders you get are actually, they're just apple juice. They're filtered. They usually have some sort of preservative in them and so forth. But what we do is we literally just squeeze the juice out, put it in a 2-liter jug and freeze it immediately. Yeah. And then when you take it out, it's as good or better than when you froze it. And so there are no preservatives, like a lot of them actually use baking soda as a preservative, which affects the flavor, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So most people have never tried a really good fresh cider.
I've had it once or twice, and I will agree there's nothing like it. Like apple juice isn't even on the same planet. It shouldn't even be in the same category. It's I
mean, a good cider actually will be cloudy. It will have they're fine, but there are pieces of apple in it, and that's what intensifies the flavor. You take those out and it's more watery.
Absolutely. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, it's good stuff. For your typical tree that someone like me would plant, what kind of yields could I expect if I'm taking care of the tree in a reasonable way and it's 4, 5, 6 years old? I mean, what am I looking at poundage wise?
That's a tough one because they vary so much in productivity. I have some that are extremely productive, and a reasonably mature tree would give you a bushel of fruit.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, if you have a small young tree, like maybe I don't know how many pounds, maybe 30 pounds or something like that, but um, especially if you have a standard tree, you can get sometimes a older one might get 2 bushels of apples. So
Okay. Okay. That sounds, yeah, that's reasonable. I like it. Well, Bob, we've covered a lot of ground. Thank you for answering all of my questions, and I'm feeling very inspired. I think I'm going to go head to Google here once we get off and do some shopping, see what I can find. Can you give everybody the scoop on your book? Because I think by the time this episode goes live, we're recording it a little early, but by the time people are watching this, your book should be on shelves. Tell us how we can find it.
well, you should be able to go to any major bookstore or online and to find it. And just called Hardy Apples. It's very simple, Hardy Apples. And as far as I know, it should be available pretty much any place that sells books because they are promoting it fairly heavily. It's a hard cover, which I'm glad to see because I find soft cover just fall apart after a while, and a hardcover is more like a resource book.
Yes. Yes.
And it has we have about 90 some cultivars that we tell the history of, and the hardiness, what it looks like, and it can be used if people are sleuthing apples too, they can use it too to help them ID maybe some of these older apples as well.
Yes. I will say I don't have the book yet, guys, but I did see the PDF copy of it and it was fantastic. Like I've been saying on several episodes, I'm really beefing up my book library lately of those good resources. I mean, internet's fine and dandy, but I love having things in paper that I can refer to over and over again that I can trust. And this is one that's going in the library as soon as it comes out. So I'm excited for it.
I appreciate that.
Yeah. Any other oh my goodness, any other last bits of advice that you'd want to share with someone interested in apples before we jump off?
I would say that before you jump into apples, do a little bit of research. Find out about soils, figure out where the site is and so forth. Has it got good frost drainage for, because the frost will kill those blossoms in the spring and so forth. And and do some research about what kind of rootstocks that you think you should be having, and what kind of cultivars that you think would survive in your area, and also what do you want to use it for. Are you going to be cooking? Because you can only eat so many fresh apples, right? So you want apples that can keep, or that are really good for pies and crisps, that sort of thing. So, I'd say just spend a bit of time and do your research before you just go out and buy any apple you see.
I like it. So I guess I will do a little research before I go shopping today then. So we'll try not to go off half-cocked. So thank you so much, Bob. This was awesome. Everybody go out and grab a copy of Hardy Apples, the book, and I really appreciate your time. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you. It was really fun.